What happens when a nation's cry for freedom is answered with fire and steel? When cities turn to rubble, and silence falls, not from peace, but from fear. The story of the Chechen Wars is not just about territory or power. It's about people, pain, and the high cost of being unheard. The First Chechen War began in December 1994, when Russian forces entered Chechnya to suppress its push for independence. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Chechnya, under the leadership of Johar Dudayev, declared itself an independent republic. However, Russia refused to recognize this claim, viewing Chechnya as an integral part of its territory. The situation grew tense over the next few years as negotiations failed and minor clashes escalated. By late 1994, Russia launched a military operation with the belief that it could quickly crush the Chechen resistance and restore control. What followed was a brutal and chaotic conflict that revealed the unpreparedness of the Russian military and the determination of Chechen fighters. The capital Grozny became the center of heavy combat. Russian forces bombarded the city, causing massive destruction and loss of civilian life. The Chechen fighters, using guerrilla tactics, managed to resist the far larger and better-equipped Russian army. As the war dragged on into 1995 and 1996, it became increasingly unpopular in Russia, with mounting casualties and televised reports showing the horrors of the conflict. Civilian deaths numbered in the tens of thousands, and both sides were accused of human rights violations. Despite Russia's military power, they failed to achieve a decisive victory. In 1996, after a surprise Chechen attack on Grozny and rising domestic pressure, Russian leaders agreed to a ceasefire and signed the Khasevyurt Accord. This ended the war but did not resolve the issue of Chechnya's status. The war left Chechnya devastated, its infrastructure in ruins, and its people traumatized. The conflict marked one of post-Soviet Russia's most significant military failures and laid the groundwork for further violence in the years to come. The Second Chechen War began in 1999, just 3 years after the end of the first conflict. Tensions remained high, as Chechnya, though de facto independent, was plagued by lawlessness, internal divisions, and militant activity. In August 1999, Chechen-based Islamist fighters, led by Shamil Basayev and a Jordanian commander known as Khattab, launched an incursion into the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan, declaring the intention to create an Islamic state. This bold move alarmed Moscow. Soon after, a series of deadly apartment bombings occurred in Russian cities, killing hundreds of civilians. The Russian government blamed Chechen militants for the attacks, though controversy and conspiracy theories about their true origin persist to this day. Using these events as justification, Russia, now under the leadership of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, launched a full-scale military campaign to re-establish control over Chechnya. Unlike the First War, the Russian military was better organized, more aggressive, and determined not to repeat past mistakes. The capital, Grozny, was bombarded heavily once again, causing massive destruction and thousands of civilian deaths. Chechen resistance, though fierce, was eventually pushed into the southern mountains. Russia installed a pro-Moscow administration, led by Akhmad Kadyrov, who was later succeeded by his son, Ramzan Kadyrov. By 2000, the Russian government declared major combat operations over, but insurgent attacks and guerrilla warfare continued for years. The war formally ended in 2009 when Moscow ended its counter-terrorism operation, though sporadic violence remained. Throughout the conflict, there were widespread reports of human rights abuses, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings by both sides. The war helped solidify Putin's rise to power and shifted Chechnya from a separatist republic to an authoritarian region under tight Russian control. The Second Chechen War left a legacy of fear, repression, and deep scars in the North Caucasus. The capital of Chechnya became one of the most devastated cities in modern warfare during the two Chechen Wars. In the First Chechen War, which began in 1994, Grozny was the central target of Russia's military campaign. The city was subjected to intense aerial bombardments, artillery shelling, and street-to-street fighting. Civilian neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and government buildings were reduced to rubble. By the time Russian forces attempted to capture the city in early 1995, Grozny had become a dangerous battlefield. Despite heavy losses, Chechen fighters used their knowledge of the terrain to mount strong resistance, forcing Russian troops into a drawn-out urban conflict. Thousands of civilians were trapped in basements without food or medicine as the siege intensified. In 1996, after a surprise Chechen offensive, rebels briefly regained control of the city, leading to the signing of a ceasefire. However, Grozny's destruction was already severe, and little was done to rebuild the city in the years that followed. When the Second Chechen War began in 1999, Grozny once again became the main battlefield. Russian forces surrounded the city and issued evacuation warnings, but many civilians remained trapped. The ensuing months saw even more aggressive bombing campaigns than the First War. By early 2000, Grozny was largely captured by Russian forces, but at a devastating human cost. Satellite images and on-the-ground reports described the city as looking like a graveyard of concrete and steel. In 2003, the United Nations declared Grozny the most destroyed city on Earth. The city's population had either fled or perished, and entire districts were flattened. The destruction of Grozny became a symbol of the brutality of the Chechen Wars, not just in terms of military tactics, but in the scale of civilian suffering and the erasure of urban life through war. The Chechen Wars were marked by widespread human rights violations committed by both Russian forces and Chechen militants. During the First Chechen War, Russian airstrikes and artillery attacks indiscriminately targeted civilian areas, including residential neighborhoods, markets, and hospitals. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and many more were forced to flee. Russian forces were accused of using excessive force, carrying out summary executions, and engaging in looting and abuse of prisoners. The lack of accountability and transparency allowed many of these crimes to go unpunished. Chechen fighters were also implicated in violations, including hostage-taking and executions of captured Russian soldiers. The situation worsened during the Second Chechen War. Russian troops conducted so-called zachistki, or cleansing operations, which were large-scale sweeps through villages and towns in search of suspected militants. These operations often involved arbitrary arrests, torture, enforced disappearances, and killings. Men and boys were frequently detained without charges, and later found dead or never seen again. Human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented many of these abuses. But access to the region was limited, making investigations difficult. Mass graves were discovered across Chechnya, highlighting the scale of extrajudicial killings. Meanwhile, Chechen rebel groups also committed atrocities, including terrorist attacks that deliberately targeted civilians. Incidents such as the Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002 and the Beslan school siege in 2004 shocked the international community and demonstrated the extreme violence carried out by some factions. Civilians in Chechnya found themselves trapped between both sides, with little protection and no justice. The war created a climate of fear and repression, where speaking out could lead to disappearance or death. The long-term psychological trauma and loss of trust in institutions deeply scarred Chechen society, and the legacy of these violations still lingers. After the Chechen Wars, the region became a breeding ground for insurgency and terrorism, as many Chechen fighters who had survived the conflicts turned toward radical ideologies and broader militant causes. The collapse of Chechnya's political structures and the harsh conditions imposed during and after the wars contributed to growing resentment, especially among the younger generation. The brutality of Russia's counterinsurgency campaigns, combined with the lack of justice for war crimes, pushed many former fighters underground or into extremist networks. Some joined the Caucasus Emirate, a militant Islamist group seeking to create an independent Islamic state across the North Caucasus. This group launched a series of deadly attacks targeting Russian security forces and local officials. Others took part in high-profile terrorist operations that shocked the world. The 2002 Moscow theater hostage crisis, where Chechen militants took hundreds of people hostage during a performance, ended with over 100 civilian deaths after Russian forces used gas to subdue the attackers. In 2004, the Beslan school's siege involved armed militants taking over 1,000 hostages, mostly children, in a North Ossetian school. The standoff ended in a chaotic and bloody battle, leaving over 330 people dead, including many children. These incidents marked a shift from a separatist movement to a broader jihadist campaign. Some Chechen fighters eventually joined international jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda and later ISIS, participating in conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Russian authorities responded with intense crackdowns and surveillance. But the ideology and networks had already spread beyond Chechnya. The violence and instability in the region contributed to Russia's growing focus on counterterrorism. What began as a national conflict over independence evolved into a deeper, more dangerous cycle of radicalization, insurgency, and global terrorism. The consequences extended far beyond the borders of Chechnya and left lasting effects on global security dynamics. After the wars, Chechnya came under the control of Ramzan Kadyrov, the son of former rebel-turned-Russian ally, Akhmod Kadyrov, who was assassinated in 2004. Backed by the Kremlin, Ramzan was appointed as the president of Chechnya and gradually consolidated power. Under his leadership, Chechnya experienced significant reconstruction, with Grozny being rebuilt into a city. Infrastructure projects, luxury buildings, and public parks were developed as symbols of stability. While this gave an appearance of peace and recovery, it came at a high cost. Kadyrov ruled through a tightly controlled authoritarian system, with widespread reports of human rights abuses, repression of dissent, and a climate of fear. His personal militia, often referred to as the Kadyrovtsi, was accused of kidnapping, torturing, and executing suspected opponents. Many who criticized the government, journalists, activists, and even ordinary citizens faced threats, harassment, or were forcibly disappeared. Independent media and political opposition were effectively silenced. Kadyrov cultivated a personality cult, presenting himself as the protector of Chechen identity and Islam, while maintaining unwavering loyalty to Russian President Vladimir Putin. This loyalty allowed him to govern with little interference from Moscow, as long as Chechnya remained quiet and under control. Religious conservatism was also enforced in the region, with restrictions placed on women's dress, behavior, and public roles. Critics accused Kadyrov of blending state power with traditional customs to maintain dominance. Despite the calm surface, the underlying atmosphere in Chechnya remained tense. Allegations of extrajudicial killings, forced confessions, and secret prisons persisted. While open warfare ended, the region did not achieve true peace or freedom. Kadyrov's rule represents a form of stability that is tightly linked to fear and control, sustained by a political arrangement that prioritizes loyalty over democratic governance. Chechnya's post-war recovery thus became a complex mix of visible progress and hidden oppression. In the end, the history of the Chechen Wars is not just a story of battles and destruction, it is a story of deep human suffering, resilience, and the long shadows that war casts on generations. From the cries for independence to the brutal response, from the ruins of Grozny to the silence under authoritarian rule, the people of Chechnya have endured more than most can imagine. These events remind us how quickly power can destroy peace, how easily violence can silence voices, and how important it is to protect the dignity and rights of every human being, no matter where they live. As we reflect on Chechnya's painful past, may we also carry forward a commitment to justice, understanding, and a world where such suffering is never repeated. ****